There's evidence that the Sahara Desert was once green, lush, well vegetated. How did that ever happen?
Why do we have this huge die-off in the fossil record of particularly large animals as the Ice Age ends? You say the Bible contains the only credible answer to the mystery of the Ice Age through the form of Noah's flood.
Once you understand the flood, it explains a lot of things. Plus, it helps people to see that the Bible works in that way, and so you can trust what it says in other areas.
Taz, you are a geologist with CMI. You've studied Ice Age landforms across the world, and you say the Bible contains the only credible answer to the mystery of the Ice Age through the form of Noah's flood. Now, first of all, what's the mystery of the Ice Age?
Well, the mystery of the Ice Age is how the Ice Age ever came about. And when you think about it, we are actually living in an Ice Age now. Some 10% of the Earth's surface is covered in ice, in the glaciers, up in the mountains, and across flat landforms and large islands like Greenland. So there's ice there now, and people are living with it, 10%. Now, the mystery is that in the past, there was a much larger area of the Earth that was covered in ice. So we're now in an Ice Age now, but much larger in the past, and that's what's really called the Ice Age. That's what they're referring to. They call it the Quaternary Ice Age. And it was discovered by a guy called Louis Agassiz, and he did a lot of research and investigation and documentation of evidence for this Ice Age. Because when you've got ice on the continents and when you've got ice in the mountains, these glaciers, as they move, they erode and carve the land, and they carve the rocks. And so you find very, very distinctive evidence. For example, you find on rocks, you find scratches, which indicates that ice was there in the past. It doesn't always mean that, but that's one of the characteristic evidences. Also, you find distinctive valleys. They're a round U-shaped shape for these valleys, for the glaciers. Also, you find the ice will carry down rocks on it, big boulders, and it carries it long distances. And then when the ice melts, it drops them on the land. And so these are called erratic boulders. And they have got boulders which don't belong where they're sitting. So that's another evidence. And the ice, what happens is the glaciers actually carve out the landforms and make depressions. And after the ice is melted, these are left full of water, and they make lakes, and they're called kettle lakes. And so there's the ice pushes up rock and breaks up rock, and it forms this broken rock, which is called tillite. And so the glaciers have got these huge heaps of broken rock in front of them, which is called a moraine, and also at the side of them. And so you've got the lateral moraines, you've got the terminal moraines. And so based on this, Louis Agassiz was able to say, look, it looks like the world was covered with a lot more ice in the past. So he did his presentation, and he made his presentation to these scientists. And guess what? They didn't believe him. They didn't think it was possible. They were not wanting to listen to what he had to say.
It sounds like quite a lot of evidence. And how long ago was this that he suggested it, and when did it get accepted that there was an Ice Age in the past?
Well, he made a big presentation in the 1830s, so it's sort of nearly 200 years ago that he did that. And but the reason why, well, a lot of scientists are averse to new ideas, who would believe it, and it takes quite a bit of time for these things to be picked up and accepted. But the big issue was, well, what caused the Ice Age? Why would there be more ice in the past? And if they produced more ice in the past, why has it melted back? What stopped it? So that was the big questions that they had about the Ice Age, and their reluctance to believe what was presented to them as scientists by Louis Agassiz.
First of all, what you're saying is that we're in an Ice Age now, or we're coming out of an Ice Age, I guess you'd say. So 10% of the Earth is covered with ice. But in the past, more of the Earth has been covered with ice. And the mystery is, how did that more of the Earth get covered with ice? Now, first of all, can I ask how much more of the Earth has been covered with ice in the past? Because there's this popular idea, or when we think about the Ice Age, a lot of times we'll get in our heads that, the Earth covered with ice. It's the Ice Age. But I don't think that's necessarily the case. Is that right?
Well, the Ice Age we're talking about, the one that Louis Agassiz documented,
Yep.
the whole Earth was not covered with ice, but it covered parts of England, it covered parts of Asia, it covered parts of Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, more ice in New Zealand, and in North America, parts of Canada, right down into the US. Even in the Niagara Falls, ice came down to the Niagara Falls area and below that. So that was covered a large area. And it extended out, and then it melted back. So that's the mystery as to what was it, what were the conditions that caused it. And the natural go-to sort of thinking was, well, it must have been colder in the past. There must have been an extensive cold period on the Earth which caused the ice to grow.
Yep.
And so that's the go-to. But in actual fact, although it sounds logical, that doesn't really cover it, doesn't do it. And that's part of the mystery, the unanswered questions, the problems with the solutions that it put up. That's part of the mystery that scientists have wrestled with. And it's also caused them alarm thinking about, if the Ice Age affected the climate that way, what's it doing to our climate today? And they're having trouble understanding the climate today.
So Taz, we're saying that you're claiming that the Bible has the answer to this problem. But first of all, can I ask, surely this problem's been around for 200 years. How did the ice get here to start with? And how did it advance so much on the Earth? Surely secular scientists have looked into this and come up with some ideas. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. Although the puzzles have not been solved. So as I mentioned, the go-to idea is that the Earth must have been colder in the past. And so they've wrestled with ways of getting the Earth significant colder temperatures on the Earth in the past. So maybe there was a meteorite impact. That's one idea. Maybe there was a supervolcano. You can just sort of speculate and brainstorm on these things. Maybe there was a supervolcano. Maybe the sun was cooler in the past. That's another idea. Or maybe something happened with the moon to actually change the way the temperature came on the Earth. And another idea was, well, maybe there was higher CO2 in the past. So there's all these speculations that go on as to what could possibly cause it. But the problem is that they're really the basic assumption that if you're going to get an ice age, you need to cool the Earth, a drastic cooling that covers the whole of the Earth. That's not really going to solve it. And I'll explain why and how the Bible actually solves that problem. Okay. But they have come up with a very attractive model, which is widely accepted now for the Ice Age.
And so I think I heard of this while studying at university. There was something they talked about, the Milankovitch cycles, and they said that explains not only the large, the major glacial periods, but also these smaller interglacial and glacial periods as well. So what is that the theory you're going to talk about?
Exactly right. So it was in the 1920s and in the 1930s, there was a Serbian geophysicist called Milankovitch who came up with this theory. It's a very sophisticated, elaborate, all sorts of bells and whistles on this theory that explains it, and people have been very attracted to this theory. And so his idea is that it's changes in the orbital parameters of the Earth which are the driving force behind the ice ages. So the orbital parameters are basically the shape of the orbit, the eccentricity of the orbit, so whether the orbit is round or whether it's more oblong. So that's one of the ideas. And that has a cycle that comes back every 100,000 years. And that's attractive to those people who believe the Earth is very, very old.
It seems to make sense. If the Earth is further away from the sun, then it should be colder, right?
Well, you'd expect it to be colder. But there's a caveat on that. I'll explain later. Okay. But the other thing is that the angle of inclination of the Earth's axis, that changes. And so with higher inclination than we have today, it would affect the temperature on the Earth. And so that's got a cyclic time. They calculated it out. It seems to be something like 40,000 years or something like that. And then, a spinning top, when you have a spinning top and it's going around like this, and as it spins, the angle of the top moves around, it precesses.
Yeah.
And so the inclination of the axis precesses something every 20,000, 25,000 years or something like that. So this very elaborate theory, it's sort of very attractive to people, and there's so much research that can be done on it, and simulations, computer models and that. And so that's the basic go-to model as to how ice ages occurred in the past. So it produces a cooling, and you've got the recycling of cycles over and over again, producing this ice age, which is very attractive to those who believe in an old Earth, that it's existed for eons of time.
I mean, it seems to make sense. You're going to have, if you're tilted further away, if the northern hemisphere is tilted further away, if you've got a more eccentric orbit, then surely you're going to develop more ice in those areas that are colder. Does it work?
Yes, you would expect that, excepting that when they do the calculations, the Milankovitch cycle does not produce enough cooling. It doesn't produce enough temperature variation.
Okay.
That's
an issue.
That is an issue, exactly right. And so it's a very attractive theory. It's a great model, but it doesn't really work. So if you really like the model, do you know what happens? What people do next?
What do they do to?
They invent a secondary hypothesis. They add something onto it to try to make it work. So rather than saying the model doesn't work, they add something to it. And so the secondary hypothesis is that the small changes produced by the Milankovitch cycles is amplified by carbon dioxide. The way carbon dioxide is absorbing sunlight, and the way it's absorbed into the oceans and that. So the carbon dioxide produces an amplification. That's called positive feedback. So we all know what positive feedback is like. We've experienced it, in a room where there's a public address system, and it gets positive feedback. It goes, just goes out of control.
Louder and louder and
louder. And
louder.
louder. It deafens everybody. Yep. And so that's positive feedback. It's essentially an unstable system. So this model of the Earth's climate, it's actually produces an unstable system. And that's partly why climate scientists are scared to death, that a small change in the Earth's temperature is going to cause the whole of the climate of the Earth to fall off a cliff. And you've heard of the idea that we're facing an existential crisis, that we've only got so many years left, and these sorts of things.
Of course,
it's all tied into this model of the Milankovitch cycle and the unstable feedback system to try to make the Milankovitch cycle work.
Okay, wow. So are you saying here, Taz, that one of the reasons we're so scared about climate change now is because we've tried to explain the Ice Age without the Bible?
That's exactly right. And it's interesting, Noah's flood, and we get to that, get to the effects of Noah's flood. But after the flood, the Bible records that God said, he said this, that while the earth remains, there'll be seed time and harvest, summer and winter, cold and heat. In other words, there's an implication there that God has created a stable system. And we'll see, I'll explain just why it is indeed a stable system and how the evidence comes to show that, and that there's really no cause for this, cataclysmic alarmism that's in our culture today.
Okay, so you're saying that God says, I've given you a stable system. After the flood, I'm not going to flood the world again. I'm going to give you seasons. So, and I guess this kind of matches up with nature in general, because the majority, although there are positive feedback mechanisms in nature, the majority of natural or biological systems, we see negative feedback loops, which I guess is support for the design inference that, okay, things are designed, so God's designed things to not get out of control.
That's right. The system is basically stable.
Yeah. But you're saying to make the Ice Age work, you need a positive feedback loop.
Well, that's what they've included in their model. They've got a model for how it works.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't really produce enough, so they've added this thing in.
Yep.
But even if it did work, even if it did produce enough temperature change, it still wouldn't produce an ice age. That's because to produce ice, you not only need a cool temperature, you also need water. And so if you just cool the Earth, basically we end up with cold deserts and not heaps of ice, not ice sheets that cover the deserts. And so that's the second thing. And that's the other way in which the biblical history and Noah's flood explains how to get water as well as, well, not necessarily coolness, but how you get the water which is going to produce the ice.
Wow. Okay. So I want to get onto that, but just to cover what we've said so far, the issue with the Ice Age, the mystery of the Ice Age, which was that question I had at the start, is one, the current theories, the most popular theory, the Milankovitch cycle theory, does not get the Earth cold enough unless you include these feedback mechanisms, which we're saying are unlikely because positive feedback mechanisms are more rare, negative feedback mechanisms are more common. But secondly, there's not enough moisture in the air or enough precipitation to make the ice and the snow. Is that right? So there's two big problems.
Well, there's two, and there's another one as well.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
It's not really a fatal problem, but it's a problem that they're wrestling with.
Yeah.
And that's the Milankovitch cycle. It's cyclical.
Yep.
Happens over and over and over again.
Yes.
So from the uniformitarian, their particular position that what's happening in the present has happened in the past, always been the same. So they would expect multiple ice age over and over and over and over again for as long as the Earth's existed. But they identify that there's sort of advances and retreats of the ice sheet in the Quaternary Ice Age, the one that's the most recent one. But although they identify those, they don't really see much evidence for really cold periods in other parts of geological history. So any time that they sort of see scratches or they see broken rock, they interpret it as an ice age. But those evidences are quite different from the rocks and scratches that we see for the most recent ice age. And so that's part of the problem that they have. Although they do speak about something like 4 ice age periods. There's a couple, there's one, I think, in the Cambrian, and there's one in the Permian that's there, and then there's one in the Precambrian. It's actually the one in the Precambrian. The idea is that the whole Earth was covered in ice.
Wow.
They give it a name. It's called Snowball Earth. And that creates problems for itself, but that's just a period there. And then there's another one a bit earlier. So there's 4 periods with basically, it's a bit surprising that the Earth seems to be so warm. It seems to have such a warm period. And that comes from misinterpreting the geology as well. And so the biblical history changes that as well.
So you're saying there's not just one ice age, at least in the secular view. There's 5 main ones that one you're saying there's good evidence for, we can see on the surface, all those evidence, as you said at the start. But those other 4, you're saying that's in the sedimentary rock, sedimentary layers. They can see scratches and so striations and things like this. But you'd say that evidence isn't as strong as the one for the most recent one.
Evidence doesn't speak for itself.
Yeah, true.
Evidence is interpreted. And so when the geologists see this evidence, they see evidence of scratches, and this great big heaps of broken rock. They assume that that's an old ice age. But you can get broken rock and all this material by other processes. And from a biblical perspective, when you look at the biblical flood, and we'll get onto that, when you look at the biblical flood and the enormity of that catastrophe, particularly at the beginning of the flood, and how the flood waters were washing in sediment, broken rock, you end up with lots of what they call underwater avalanches. So these things occur underwater, and they get great big heaps and piles of this sediment and broken rock, and they just automatically say, oh, that's tillite. That's as a result of a glacier. It's automatically interpreted that way, and usually by young geologists who go out and look at it. And once they've made the interpretation, people don't go back and change it. They just accept what's been said and then build on it. So it's sort of leading down an interpretation which is producing things that don't work. And so what happens, guess what they call it? Mysteries. The Bible explains it. That's the amazing thing. When you start with biblical history, it just flows out of that. You don't have to add in secondary hypotheses and all those sorts of things. And not only that, it gives insights to things that you'd expect, and then when you go and look, you see them. And so I'll talk about some of those later.
I really want to get onto that, Taz. But first of all, I just want to clarify something you were saying earlier. You were saying there's an issue with having multiple ice ages in the distant past because some of those ice ages, is this correct, that some of those ice ages are in layers of sedimentary rock where you find animals that lived in very hot or temperate environments? And so how did those animals survive that ice age? Is that one of the problems you're referring to?
Well, that is one of the problems. You find not just animals, but you find plants
as well,
which you find them buried in sediments which are very high latitudes, so in areas which are cold today, and yet these plants are tropical sorts of plants. And so how do you solve that? That's another question as well. And so the idea is that the continents moved over millions of years, and so the plants grew differently. But again, the biblical ice age, the biblical model solves that.
So the mysteries we've said so far, the big mystery is it's not cold enough. There's not enough water and moisture to bring enough ice. But there's some other mysteries that you haven't mentioned, but I'm sure you could comment on them, and I'm wondering if you could comment on them. One of them is, what about Siberia and Alaska being even in the last ice age? The lowlands of Siberia and Alaska were not covered with ice because they had a lot of animal and plant life there. Another one being that the fossil record shows that, just talking about the last ice age, that the majority of large animals died off at the end of the ice age, not during. And you would have thought it would be after the ice age that they would live and flourish. So there's a number of these other smaller mysteries. And could you comment on them before we talk about how the biblical model explains it?
I think if we talk a little bit about the model to begin with, that will help to set the scene. Okay. But basically what happens is, when something doesn't fit, it's called a mystery. We know, we see that there's been a lot of large animals, which very large, greater than something like 100 pounds, 40 kilograms or something, that lived in continents around the world that died out at the end of the ice age. How did that happen? And so what caused that? And there's various ideas. Some say, well, they were hunted by people. People killed them. And yet a lot of these animals died out before there were people living in the area. Another one is that these animals got sick. They called it over-ill, the over-ill idea. And that doesn't really work. Another one is, they call it the over-chill, is that the climate changed, and that one does seem to work, and that's, again, explained by the biblical flood and by the biblical model. You see, the Bible, I'll just get onto that. The Bible tells us about the global flood, which affected the whole of the earth. It talks about the fountains of the deep breaking open, and in the rocks and that which were deposited in the flood, we see a lot of evidence for volcanic activity. They used to call them large, igneous provinces, and we got evidence for that. There's the ring of fire around the Pacific, volcanic eruptions. These occurred during the flood. And so at the end of the flood, after the waters had run off the land, the oceans were warmer than they are today. And so a number of degrees, 10 degrees or something warmer. And that's widely recognized with these ice cores that go down. It's recognized the change of isotope ratios, that they were warmer in the past towards the bottom of the ice cores. And so warmer oceans, that means that there's a lot more evaporation. So the evaporation produces snow and rainfall, precipitation on the continents. So that produces the water. So your snow on the continents builds up, and so immediately after the flood, these conditions allowed for the ice and snow and ice to start building up on the continents. Plus, there was one other thing that was present at the end of the flood. With the volcanic activity, there would have been a lot of volcanic dust high, really high in the atmosphere. And so that would prevent the sunlight coming in and reduce the amount of melting that occurred in summer. And so from summer to summer, from year to year, you have this ice building up on the continents. And it starts, of course, in the higher elevations and then eventually comes down into the lower elevations, and the ice builds up. And so one estimate by one meteorologist, a climate scientist who specializes in the Ice Age, by Michael Ord, he estimates it would have taken something like 500 years for the ice to build up on the continents. And that's because the oceans are warm. And that has a lot of implications for other things, which I'll get onto. But after the ice peaked at the glacial maximum, the oceans were cooling. So once they started cooling, the ice, there was less precipitation, the ice melted back. And so it melted back a bit quicker than in 500 years. About 200 years, the ice had melted back, and so to around about the level where we are today. And so there's a lot of features that come as a result of that. But that's a very simple model that explains why it started, and why we see it, why it built up, and then why it melted back. And we don't have anything really elaborate in it as far as these funny, what you might say, cycles of the Earth's orbit and that sort of thing. See, it happened quickly. After the flood, which was about 4,500 years ago, wasn't millions of years ago. The millions of years comes from the geologists who believe in long ages because they don't believe in the catastrophic flood.
Okay, so it's the Bible provides the answer through Noah's flood, because I guess first of all what we'd need to know is that, and I think it was maybe presupposed there, is that the flood was a highly tectonic active event. And it produced a lot of volcanoes, undersea volcanoes, a lot of magma coming up. There was a lot of heat that heated the seas. And that was the thing that gave the moisture, because that was the issue we were talking about before. The big mystery was the amount of moisture, the amount of snow and ice. And if you've got hot seas, you've got a lot of evaporation.
Yeah.
You've got a lot of evaporation. You've got a lot of rainfall and snow and ice fall as you get on the continent. So you've got hot seas, cold land masses.
That's right. So, but the warm seas is the main thing. It doesn't take much. Warmth, extra warmth, to greatly increase the amount of evaporation that's on the oceans.
Yeah, I've heard that.
So that's the first thing, and the other thing about it is that it explains, a lot of things to do with migration, to do with animals, to do with habitats.
Yeah, some of these smaller mysteries. So can you tell us about why did all the large animals die off after the Ice Age?
Well, first of all, why did they live in Siberia?
Yeah, well, how did they live? Yeah, no, you're right.
We have the woolly mammoths, and that's, the Ice Age movies. They have these animals living in these places, don't they? They weren't living on the ice. They were living in this area where there was ice.
Yeah.
And so the woolly mammoths lived in Siberia, and the climate was far more equitable. Yeah. And so there was lots of vegetation, there was lots of rainfall, and so what happened was there was lots of food, lots of water. And
so this is in the middle of the Ice Age?
As the Ice Age built up. So where did the animals come from? They came from Noah's Ark. So it was the elephant kind that came off the ark. Some went into India, some went into Africa, some went into Siberia. So you have this elephant kind there, a woolly mammoth. So, it would be adapted to the slightly colder climate there, but it was perfect. There were a lot of other animals there as well.
Yeah, so can we talk about the Siberia and Alaska? So these are right near the north poles, Siberia and Alaska. And in the lowlands, I was saying, there's a mystery. Why was it temperate? Why did any animals live there at all? Because under the secular model, where the Earth cooled and cooled and cooled, and more ice came, then surely the lowlands should be covered by ice. So how does the Bible explain, or Noah's flood explain, the temperate environments where you could get the woolly mammoths, the different animals living in Alaska and Siberia?
Well, it's to do with the warm oceans. And
Right.
so where the Arctic is now, there's a great big ice sheet which is floating on the ocean. And so the ocean there was cold. It's cold now, but it wasn't cold at the end of the Ice Age. It was warm. And so there was the land around that area, on the continents, would have been quite habitable.
Yes.
At the end of the Ice Age. Yes. And so these animals migrated up there from the Middle East after the flood, along with a lot of other animals that lived there. And so there was an incredible prolific community that was there. And so that explains why they're there. It answers that mystery without even trying.
Yeah, so it's the warm oceans, just to make it really clear, it's the warm oceans making the coastal areas on the land a nice area to live, a temperate environment, whereas as you go to the middle of the continents, of course, that's where all the snow and the ice was.
That's where the ice is. And it's not just up in the Arctic, in that area, but around most of the continents.
Yes.
And so the area was quite easy to live in, quite livable, in so much parts of the world at the end of the flood. There's one other big consequence of this, is that Earth's climate is stable. So there was a huge, you could call it a perturbation, but it's a bit big for a perturbation, but a big deviation from where it is now, from its stable position. So the oceans were warmer and this big deviation occurred, and the Earth returned to stability. It took 700 years, but it returned to a stable position. And so that should give confidence and it should give some sort of sense of relief to people to realize that we live in a world which is designed to be stable, designed for people to live in, and we shouldn't be terrified that there's going to be some sort of tipping off the edge of a cliff as a result of climate. So that's one great consequence of this particular model.
So you're saying that some of the recent warming that we're seeing is actually just the Earth returning to its normal stability. So maybe before the flood, it was hotter. I've heard in the record we had greater levels of CO2 and greater temperature when we look at isotope ratios and things like this in the past. So before the flood, the Earth was warmer and we are returning to that warmer state. Would that be correct?
It seems to be like that. We don't have a great handle on what it was exactly like before the flood, although we do know that the continents had lots of vegetation on them, and which was ripped up during the flood. But the Ice Age, the post-flood Ice Age, is a very simple consequence of the events of Noah's flood, and it's a pity that people have forgotten about it, because it provides insights into so many things.
And there was one other thing I wanted to touch on. You said earlier was that one of the other ingredients for causing an ice age is cooler summers. And I think that's an important point, because you said the way that Noah's flood causes the cooler summers is the aerosols from the volcanoes, the aerosols from the tectonic activity that was coming up, they would have caused the Earth to have a greater albedo, so more of the sun was reflecting off them, so it means the summer doesn't get quite as hot. And I think that's probably a major issue in developing an ice age model is, well, okay, you get more ice in the winter, if you get precipitation and build up in the winter, then the summer just melts it off. But if you've got the summers slightly cooler, and so that's another unique thing that the Noah's flood does, is it creates a cooler summer for the ice to remain.
That's the model, or the insights from the Ice Age. The Bible doesn't actually talk about aerosols being in the atmosphere and that sort of thing. And it doesn't actually talk about great volcanoes, and that's been pieced together by us looking at the geological evidence. But it does provide a framework, a time framework of how long the waters took to rise, and how the Ark came to rest, and how long it took for the waters to come off the land. And when we look at the geology, we can sort of piece this together and work out where it fits. And so the Ice Age was after that. Now, the secular person, that they have got this long view in their mind, and so they say the Ice Age sort of began about 2.6 million years ago, and it lasts to about 11,000 years ago. And so they have got this long age model in their minds, but in actual fact, it wasn't 2.6 million years ago. It was after the flood, about 4,500 years ago. And so that's the length of it, 700 years for that particular Ice Age period. And since then, which the secularists, they would say 11,000. But from a biblical perspective, it was about, it was less than 4,000, something like 3,000 years ago. That's when things have been stable. But there have been changes since then with the medieval warm period, and then there's a cold period, little ice age and that. But basically the climate is stable. There's another thing, is that the ice age explains the mass extinction which occurred at the end of the ice age. That's so.
How does it explain that?
Well, the animals, these large animals which lived on the lands, where did they come from? They came from Noah's Ark. So all the animals, everything that breathed there, lived on the land. The original kinds came off the ark and they multiplied up, and then they migrated out to different parts of the world.
And we said how they existed because of the warm oceans, and they could exist in even in the northern
parts.
They
could migrate there.
But how did they die off?
Well, how did they get there? That's another question that comes about. It's probably better to deal with that one first. How did they get there? Yeah. Well, when the ice was on the continent, so you have the ice being precipitated, the ice and the snow on the continents. That means the ocean levels are lower.
Okay.
And so that's widely recognised that the ocean levels were lower. And there are maps of various continents. There are maps of Australia as to what the size of the continent would be during the Ice Age. And they've given it a name. I think it's called Sowell or something like that. And so you can see this large expanse of Australia when the ocean levels were lower. And as a matter of fact, the estimate is that it's about 50 to 60 metres lower
than today's
sea level.
Wow!
And so that means that the land, the ocean, the land, the shoreline was farther out to sea than it is today. And so that would have been areas which vegetation was on. That would have been areas where the rivers flowed across to get to the ocean. So you can actually see these the river courses under the ocean today since the ocean's returned to its level. So with the larger area of land, that means that people could migrate easier. So they could migrate down through Indonesia into Australia. So you would be able to get animals into Australia. And also they could migrate across the Bering Strait into North America. So the first sort of people that got there, they would have come from the Ark and they would have migrated in there. So you've got jaguars which have come into North America and down into South America. So that was, a really easy way to explain that is it was when the ocean levels were lower during the flood, after the flood, when the Ice Age was nearing its peak. So that's another simple explanation that comes out so easily to explain the current biogeography on the Earth as a result of what happened in the Ice Age, along with other things such as log mats and vegetation mats, which are the result of Noah's flood as well.
Yeah, amazing. So one of the methods of the animals spreading out from Turkey, where the Ark landed, would have been via land bridges when the ice was up on the continents. Taking some of the water from the oceans meant that oceans were 50 meters lower, so they crossed across land bridges. Something is a little side note, but it was interesting what you were saying there. I wanted to ask was, you said the shorelines would have been further out, and so the streams would have been further out. Now, there's some of what we call today submarine canyons. Now, some of them are very big and deep. I've heard I think they're even deeper than the Grand Canyon and things like that. So does that speak of the flood again? Because was that the floodwaters running off that caused deeper canyons there?
It speaks of the floodwaters running off. So rivers flowing across these areas would cut sort of channels which are the same size as the river channels today, but these canyons were enormous that go that we see larger than Grand Canyon, as you say, and that was the waters of Noah's flood running off what a lot of people call the recessive stage, as the waters receded off the land. And we've got the continental shelves as well as the waters receded off the land. But we come to the extinction of this massive extinction.
I'm glad you came back to that, because we didn't get there. So I'll ask you that, Taz. So they got there via the land bridges. They were fine during the Ice Age because of the warm oceans making the lowlands a temperate environment. But why did they die off? Why do we have this huge die-off in the fossil record of particularly large animals as the Ice Age ends?
They multiplied up after the flood. So there were lots and lots of these animals, and we find the remains of them. Not, I suppose you could call them fossils, but they're not really fossilized, but we find the remains of them, skulls of them, bones of them. And so on all the continents, perhaps not New Zealand, but that's not a continent, but on Africa and in Europe and North America and that sort of thing. And so after the flood, the Ice Age, during the Ice Age, the conditions were excellent for animals to multiply and live. So you've got a climate that doesn't vary much between summer and winter. You have lots of precipitation. You also, we talked about that. And so you got lots of vegetation. Yeah. There's lots of water, so there's plenty for them to drink.
Can you just explain why doesn't the climate vary from like summer and winter as much now as it did in the Ice Age?
Because the oceans were warmer. The oceans were warmer, and so there's not as wide a spread of temperatures as there is today.
You have a great heat capacity with the oceans, and so that warm ocean would prevent the depths of the summer and winter.
That's right. So, and the basic crux of it is the conditions were excellent for animals to live and multiply and grow, and there's some very, very large ones, these large animals. But as the Ice Age progressed and as we get through the peak of the Ice Age, the climate starts to change. The oceans cool, and so you start to get a bigger difference between summer and winter. And so that's one thing that occurs. You get less precipitation, so you get more droughts which occur. And then it also affects, with the wider temperature variation, you get a lot more wind. So there's a lot more dust blown around. And we find that in the Siberia, and that where these woolly mammoths are buried in dust. Same sort of thing that happened in North America, the Dust Bowl they called it, when there was a lot of dust which was blown around and buried houses and that destroyed farms. So there's a lot more dust being blown around, and the winds and the dryness means there'd be a lot more fires. And so it was really not that good for these animals to live there. And so they died out. A lot of them died. A lot of extinction of these animals occurred. And it occurred on every continent where these animals were. And so that's a very, very simple explanation for this massive extinction that occurred. Plus there's something else that ties in with this, is that you see, the secularists believe in multiple ice ages.
Yes.
So in this ice age, they say it goes from 2.6 million years to 11,000 years.
That's the most recent one.
That's the most recent one. They've got multiple ice ages which occur, and they recognise this extinction, but it only occurs after the last ice age.
Oh, yeah. So why didn't it happen in the other ice ages?
Why didn't it happen in the other ice ages? And that's because it was really just one ice age. The climate was different as the ice was building, and these so-called multiple ice ages are just variations. Ice advancing, ice retreating, but basically a continual build-up of this ice sheet. And it was only after the ice age peak, the last, into the glacial they talk about. It's only after that where the climate drastically changed and the animals went extinct. So over-chill is a good way of explaining that, rather than being killed and hunted by humans.
Over-chill. So it actually got...
Change of climate.
So the climate changed. So coming out of the Ice Age, it got colder. Is that right?
It was more extreme. It was colder. Yeah. Coming out of the Ice Age, and it was hotter in the summer. So there was a big change in climate.
Right, I see. Okay. Because it seems almost counterintuitive that there was an over-chill after the Ice Age, but you're saying because there was the more extreme variations in winter and summer, that was not as good for a lot of the animals there. So generally, I think what you're describing is this, during the Ice Age, it was a really good time to be alive, for animals at least,
yes.
Maybe for humans as well. It's a good time to be alive. It's a temperate environment. And so that's really not what we think. As I was just going back to my thought was earlier, that the Ice Age is, people often think about a ice ball Earth, or like this Earth covered in snow. But of course, you said earlier, that's not the most recent ice age in the secular view. That's a previous ice age.
That's right.
Now, you mentioned there was a problem with that. Could you just expand on that? If the Earth really was covered in snow, and I'm guessing it's something to do with the reflectivity, the albedo of the Earth at that point.
Well, it supposedly occurred in the Precambrian.
Yep.
This one, and I want to get back to just talking about the extinction of these animals
and
some of the
finish.
Conditions. No, we'll talk about this Snowball Earth.
Okay. And then
so they call it Snowball Earth when the whole Earth was covered with snow.
Yep.
And so that means there's a lot of reflection of sunlight.
Yep.
And so the question is, if you do get the Earth covered with snow, and so they create this ice age, Snowball Earth, how are you ever going to stop it?
Get it out, right.
Because you can't get the heat in to melt the snow. And so that's the problem. That's one of the issues.
So that would be a positive feedback loop in that case.
Well, it's just, it's sort of set in ice, in ice. But also the other thing that occurred as a result of that is that, evolution is supposedly occurring.
Yes, how do you get animals alive on an ice?
And so you've got these multicellular animals which have just evolved, and then you cover the whole Earth with snow.
You've got to start again.
You've got to start again. So that's the other problem is how do you explain evolution in a Snowball Earth? And
how old did you say the Snowball Earth was?
It goes back before the Cambrian, Precambrian, about 600 million years ago in their thinking.
Yeah.
But it didn't ever happen.
Yeah, well, there's a number of problems with it, isn't there? Sorry, I interrupted you. So you were saying the reasons they died off is because the Ice Age was actually a really nice environment for them to live in.
That's right.
And the environment changed. And I was pointing out, gosh, it seems a bit it seems like a mind shift to think that the Ice Age is a good environment to live in. But part of that is just understanding the Earth wasn't fully covered with ice. It was just parts.
Yeah, it was a great environment to live in.
The coastlands were the place to live.
And that creates another puzzle, an enigma, because there's evidence that the Sahara Desert, which is a desert, was once green, lush, well vegetated. How did that ever happen? Well, of course, the early part of the Ice Age explains this with great precipitation. And so that explains the green deserts that are around in the past. Plus, there are lakes which today are dried out, almost dried out, which there's evidence in the past they were full of water and teeming with life. And so they've dried out as a result of the end of the Ice Age and the reduction in precipitation. So there's a lot of interesting features like this, which are puzzles. And for people who are interested in the environment, they're trying to figure out what happened in the past and how can we avoid it in the future. You'll never solve these problems if you don't really know what happened and you don't really understand the global flood and the effects of the changing climate immediately after the flood and why it's different from today. You really need to take account of that.
Wow, that's amazing, because I've seen that in the Sahara Desert when they've taken satellite images. They can see drainage basins, so they understand this used to be huge lakes, and there's a lot of lakes that are empty today, as you're saying. But I think what you're telling me, Taz, is that the only way to explain those lakes existing in the past is if there was a higher amount of precipitation and rainfall in those areas that are closer to the equator, less close to the pole, that are now more desert areas. And that's explained by the hotter waters of Noah's flood.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
So you can see the Ice Age, it's a big, multifaceted topic, isn't it? It covers so many things, and it illustrates just the vast difference in thinking between those secular scientists who don't believe that the global flood really happened. They don't believe the history in the Bible. They think they can piece it together by looking at the rocks and then coming up with these hypotheses in their own minds about what might have happened. It's sort of brainstorming and speculation. But once you understand the flood, it explains a lot of things. It's such a contrast to what we see scientists in the world and what we hear in the media today. And so the global flood makes a big difference to understanding that. Plus, it helps people to see that the Bible works in that way So it's reliable, it's trustworthy, and so you can trust what it says in other areas. You can trust the geology, you can trust the climatology, you can trust the ice age geology and all that sort of thing. And so then you can trust what it talks about on morality and about human nature and about our need for salvation and the world to be redeemed. So it provides us with hope rather than this other speculation, which is the idea of fear and panic that we're going to fall off a cliff because because the cows and that, we've got too many cows in the world. And so it's a great way. I think it's the understanding the Ice Age. It just provides so much insight and confidence and gives ideas as to things to explore, and it actually works.
Yeah, it's really exciting, Taz, to see that some of these mysteries, and I'm glad you explained to us the mysteries, some of these mysteries are solved, some of these earth science mysteries are solved with the biblical history. And what you're explaining there is, well, if we can see the biblical history matches with the physical world, then that gives us a greater trust that it's the truth. And so if we see that's the truth in terms of history, then maybe it's also the truth, or we know it's also the truth in terms of morality and
salvation.
And salvation, yeah, because we understand that we're fallen. We understand that our morals don't meet the morals of God, and then that's why we need Jesus. So the Ice Age can point to Jesus.
It's amazing, isn't it? The flood solves it, and it points to Jesus.
Taz, thanks a lot for your time today and explaining to us the mystery of the Ice Age and how it's solved by the Bible's history, specifically the biblical flood.
Been great to talk with you, Scott.
Thanks, Taz.